Thank you, Hedvig, very much for introducing my modest personality. Yeah, it's me. I recognize myself. Yeah, except one detail. I'm not properly art historian. And this, in fact, it's a big problem for me because here on the stage I feel myself a bit uncomfortable because I'm among serious, solid scholars. Me, who is an irresponsible bohemian independent curator, what could I contribute to this discussion? Well, only one topic, subject which I found in my heritage. It's in fact an exhibition project, Interpol, which not by chance it was just mentioned in the course of our 2 days intense work, because in the 90s, in transitional 90s, this exhibition became emblematic, in fact, in a sense that it focused in itself complexity of political, social, and also artistical relations, East-West relations in the first decade of globalization. In fact, I'm recalling often this night in Ljubljana when in an Irish bar we discussed this exhibition with Igor Zabel and Piotr Piotrowski, and in fact, famous text "We and the Others" of Igor appeared a few weeks after that. Appeared in fact first as a conference paper in Moscow, in a conference to which I invited him, and after that the first publication was done in Moscow Art Magazine, and a publication which I'm founded and editing till nowadays. Well, this project perhaps became well known, and I have not perhaps to some of you introduce the whole context and story of this project, but still I see a lot of young faces in this in the audience. So let me give some comments on how this project, this exhibition, came to life. From the early 90s in Moscow, I started to do a series of experimental projects, which I defined as dialogical exhibitions. And myself, a curator of these exhibitions, I defined it as a curator moderator. My idea was that instead of conventional white box exhibition, instead of inviting artists with some concrete pieces, something just produced, something just existing, or perhaps with something which artists have to produce for the space, I changed the strategy and I proposed a project which presumed that curator is only launching the certain project. Curator is also proposed perhaps the line of collaboration. Curator is proposing perhaps the acts of what could happen, the certain model, a possibility of acting, performatively acting. Performatively not in a sense to do a performance, but in a sense of extending work on the project in time. I was also arrived to the idea that I can delegate, partly delegate the certain curatorial duties to the artist. In some of my projects, artists could write to invite other participants of the projects, building a team or working individually parallel to the artist whom they considered to be crucially important for such an enterprise we were developing together. Once in the course of my work on a project which was named Hamburg Project, a young, very flamboyant, sympathetic person from Sweden, Jan Åman, young curator from Stockholm, came into Contemporary Art Center, very small and fragile, economically fragile institution, which, by the way, in a few years disappeared. And he saw on the stage one of the faces of Hamburg project, a project which, was in action for minimum half a year, even before. He was fascinated with what I was doing, what we were doing, because my activity at that time is absolutely inseparable from the artists who were enthusiastically working with me and who contributed basically to what in fact could be named dialogical project in Moscow in the 90s. And in fact, he started to discuss with me a possibility to do something together in Stockholm. He provided economical support from the Swedish Institute. He invited me to come to Stockholm. At a certain moment, I proposed him a model for the international version of dialogical curatorship. Of the moderational curatorship. The idea was that each of us, me and Jan Åman, each of us could invite some figures from both locations, from Moscow and from Stockholm, delegating them rights to invite other artists to work together. So they should build a small team. It could be one extra artist or three artists or more. That could be an artist or even not an artist. So the idea was to work collectively, to work in a team. And the second condition was that this artist should propose not just a project for one precise point of the exhibition space, but this project should be, as we defined them, total. That should be a project for the whole space. So inevitably, that as we preview, they should produce a certain conflict in between projects, because all the projects were conceived for the same space. So the certain personal encounter of the artist or of the group artist seem to be inevitable, but not just for general abstract theoretical text, but for the common solution of the very concrete problem, because definitely this project should in some way to conflict with each other. So the idea was that in a course of conversation, collaboration, discussion, we should negotiate inevitable conflicts. So we counted on dialogue, but not on general dialogue, but on something which, on the conversation which at the basis has a very operative, concrete demand. I was very proud of this project, of the idea, of the whole procedure I conceived, because at the late 80s, at the beginning of the 90s, I created a series of exhibitions which I defined comparative exhibitions. That was a romantic time when East was encountering the West, and the West was encountering the East, and the model which was triumphing in that time, it was, in fact, one of this exhibition was named 10 plus 10. 10 Russian, 10 Americans. But it was done Vienna, New York, Vienna, Moscow, New York, but it was done a lot of exhibitions when the certain number of the artists from some of the Eastern European country or region of the whole Eastern Europe was in proportional comparison with the artists from the Western part. One against another one. The idea was that the audience art world would appreciate how different, and particularly are artists from different parts of Europe, but in the same time to realize that, my God, but still there is a lot in common, still we can really now go ahead to each other and to establish a new kind of cultural relations. Well, I was very proud of my proposal because it's absolutely overpassed this model. This project presumed that in reality all participants of this exhibition, they have no precise identity. Because it was just 1996, by the way. Yeah, let me recall you the date. It seemed that in this precise moment, all previous identities were just erased. The world is not divided anymore. The world became global, became common. Now it's a moment when throughout collaboration, we could build new identities. We could build a new community, community without identities. In fact, in this time, Comunità che viene, coming community of George Agamben was on my table. And in fact, a fragment of this book we translated in Moscow Art magazines. It was a kind of a manifesto of that time. As minimum, it was very much coherent with an intellectual and also socially psychological atmosphere of that time. But in reality, of course, as it's quite well known, well, but in reality, as it's quite well known, something went wrong. Something went wrong, first of all, in a very concrete operational sense. Because, well, the groups of artists were formed, well, because my colleague from Stockholm, he really invited a group of artists. Each of them really in some way gave him a confirmation that he is going to propose some other artists which according to them fits to the project. These groups of artists from both sides in some way were appeared, but to my disappointment, I was not getting the textual explanation of the project. It was absolutely unclear what we would expect from the, let's say, Swedish part. Finally, we met. The first meeting happened in Stockholm, and here we realized. I realized, and also artists who came with me realized that from the Western side, let's say, let's define the Western part of the project. The artists were not very much coherent with the whole idea. They were not understanding the sense of discussion. They came without project. Some of them said, "We just came to understand what it's all about." Some of them did not came, but came to the party in the night. So the whole structure, which should, not simply impose a certain discipline, but should guarantee realization of my wonderful project, really did not work at all. And even the certain hostility we noticed, because Western artists were a bit even scandalized with the intellectual aggressivity the artist from the East, of their capacity to quote philosophers, to propose a very hardcore theory, to defend their position, to present very well-defined project. It seemed to be, in fact, just a mafia band from Moscow who came really very well, with weapons, with guns, very aggressively on the tanks. So the certain frustrations, the certain aggressivity was accumulating. And finally, when I came to conclusion that in fact my beautiful project, there is no condition to realize it, institutional argument was put on the table. Money are spent. Money are spent. Institution, it's Fabriken. It's a new contemporary art center in Stockholm, is waiting for something. So something should be done. Well, the certain diplomatical solution was found in the sense that let's realize what artist wants to do. There were some interesting collaborative projects which came mostly from let's say, eastern part. And those artists who are not interested to collaborate, let them present whatever they want. And in fact, I just put my step aside and I suspended to sign this exhibition as entirely mine. And early 1996, January exhibition was opened. But, and here it's very important, one technical details. Unfortunately, Contemporary Art Center Fabriken unsucceeded to produce practically most of the projects from the artists from the Eastern group. So practically what was on the stage, there were only remains of the projects, or some of the projects of the Swedish artists, which were just taken from the gallery, transported to the exhibition space and installed. And in fact, an artist who was very smart in managing his project, it's Van de Goo. It's a Chinese artist from New York, who was in fact invited to collaborate by Russian artist Dmitry Gutov, but who came 3 weeks before the opening, and because of his enthusiasm and energy and will to do what he wanted to do, he succeeded to realize enormous construction. He used human hairs in this construction, in his enormous installation, which in an exhibition realized in the name of collaboration and common work, an exhibition which should in some way represent a new community with identities, a new community with nationalities, a new community of the future. In this exhibition, he realized a work which occupied 3/4 of the space. In fact, at the opening of the exhibition, an artist, that time from Moscow, Alexander Brenner, he said that, considering that exhibition failed, he will represent himself not as an artist, but as a musician. He asked for this, in fact, this percussion, staff, and at the opening he was, trying to play, because this happened in first time in his life, and he was screaming some visceral sounds in a microphone. And then suddenly he stood up and he destroyed an installation of a Chinese artist, Van der Gogh. That was not a big surprise, but for let's say, for the majority of Russian participant of the exhibition, because they knew who is Alexander Brenner. And the night before, in the session, in the Last Supper, which we had, he said that exhibition, it's totally failed, it's a conformist exhibition, and I'm going to attack it. And in fact, he realized what he promised. After that, another Russian artist who was equally radical on the Moscow art scene those time, he realized that Brenner overpassed him, and he wanted to answer him with an equally strong gesture. That was Oleg Kulik, hyperstar of that time, an artist who invented a project, artist doc. Kulik was performing himself, usually on his floor, naked, as a child of nature. And that time, in fact, he came because Ernst Billgren, it's a Swedish artist, who said that he can't collaborate with another artist because he doesn't love human being, but he loves animal. And it was proposed for him to attempt to try to work with another ecological artist, who in fact behaved as a dog. But when poor Kulik came to collaborate, he just realized that beautiful paintings of Ernst Billgren are just fixed on the wall. And and nobody expect him to enter into collaboration. So he built his own doghouse. He was on a chain, and when he realized that Brenner, has done something extraordinary, beautiful, and flamboyant, he answered him. He went out from his doghouse. Here he is on the remains of the Ernst Billgren installations. He also destroyed a work of the artist who refused him as a partner in common work. And after that, as a dog, he started to bite visitors of the exhibition opening. Here he is biting the main sponsor of the exhibition. That is the story of the project. But the most important, and what in fact started to be, what initiated the whole enormous debate, that was an open letter to the art world, which was written and signed by the Western participant of the exhibitions. Artist and me, myself, Russian curator, were accused in being enemies of the Western art world, that we are against liberal, democratical Western values. And so were very strong political accusations. The interesting was that to sign were proposed Western participant of the projects, but Eastern artists were not considered in this action. It was clear that Easterns would not support disagreement with this exaggeratively radical performance. So it was immediately ethnicized, regionalized the work of this artist. And then it was also said another very interesting thing, because, applying to us who in that period of time were absolutely opened in finding a new identities. For us, it was as a method, as a gesture of disagreement, it was applied an identity of Easterns. And then it was another interesting thing, immediately with re-ideologization, because to invent an identity, to imply an identity, it's definitely an ideology. Immediately it was said another interesting sentence. A French critic, Olivier Zamek, who was present at the moment in the exhibition opening, he said, "These Russian artists are fascist." And this is also very curious because, East Russia, it's responsible for many mischiefs, mistakes, crimes, but definitely not in fascism. Fascism, it's a Western invention. It's the West who has a copyright on the fascism, not us. We don't need it. It's not ours. Take it. No, but with re-ideologization, reproposing of national, regional, ethnical identity, West applied to us their own scenes. But if that is a re-ideologization, let us be fidel Marxist. Let us recognize that ideology, it's a false consciousness. And the false consciousness, it's masking something. Well, in this modest case, in the reality situation, it's very clear. And it was never discussed, never said, that these strong ideological accusations and the whole enormously pumped discussion in Eastern fascism, in reality, it was needed very simply to mask organizational failure of the project, because works were not realized. It was really a failure project by organizers. I think that this sentence of Olivier Zamek, it's also very interesting, because in reality that was a nostalgia of young leftist French intellectuals in this post-ideological condition who was desperately waiting for ideological enemy. That was an re-ideologization from the left part. He needed continuer le combat, to go ahead with the battle, which disappeared. And it was really repumping contemporary art situation with a new ideological meaning and senses. And I have to say that in my answer and the whole debate which went ahead, I was keeping this regime of debate of ideologization and re-ideologization. In fact, I also wrote a text where I was accusing West in false consciousness, because that was in this context, it was the easiest way to defend. But in reality, as a sense, as usually behind ideology, there were some very clear pragmatical system of interests and explanations. Till nowadays, in fact, in the interpretation of Interpol, and for example, my close friend Claire Bishop, for example, in her most recent book about participation in art, she, in fact, talking about Interpol, she also said, the failure of this project was related to the fact that this methodology came to life in a very particular context of post-communist Russia in the period of transition. So a very particular condition, and also the certain cultural traditions, Russian collectivism, which was justifying this project, which was absolutely not adequate in the Western context. Partly, yes. partly yes, so-called dialogical projects, curator, moderator, all these things came from the very particular context. But at the end of the 90s, I bought in Paris Esthétique relationnelle of Nicolas Bourriaud, and it seemed me that it's a book about my professional experience. After that, in fact, my curatorial strategy I perfectly realized in Alex Farquharson definition, performative curators. And by the way, not by chance, that some artists chosen, invited for the exhibition, like Mickey von Hauswolf, brilliant Swedish artist, he perfectly fits to the whole idea. They perfectly understand what it's all about. And he proposed extremely interesting project in collaboration with another Irish artist. By the way, also not realized by organizers. The same also with Maurice Catalan, who perfectly understand what it's all about. So in reality, very often the certain innovative ideas which are coming from the East are ethnicized in counterpoint to very similar or to some practices in which they could be recognized, but it's very often it's not happened. And finally, I'm just concluding. Two final remarks. I'm returning to this very concrete case of this relatively small exhibition enterprise. Me and in fact with Irving Group, we produce that book, highly interesting book titled An Art Exhibition which Divided East and West, which in fact in some way definitely fixed this neo-ideological interpretation of Interpol exhibition. But let us deconstruct these general categories, East and West. Let us be concrete. Sven, speaker, is not present in this moment. Otherwise, he would confirm my long discussion with Piotr Piotrowski in New York. Is Russia Eastern Europe or not? He was defending an idea that it is. I was defending ideas that not. But in any case, even East, it's split in different dimensions. Well, definitely, Russia is, even if it's not Eastern Europe, definitely it's East. But is Sweden the West? That's also an interesting issue. Or could we say that Sweden or Swedish intellectuals, Swedish artists could say something for the whole West as it happened? Isn't Sweden another periphery of the West, or even not the West, but of Europe? Isn't the battle between East and so-called West in the context of Interpol in reality a conflict in between two peripheries? For which periphery it's more tough, which periphery it's more valuable, which voice of which periphery could be considered as a major one. So sometimes ideology masks that peripheral attempt to avoid the definition of periphery. And my final remark is, yesterday Jérôme provocatively said that could we avoid to talk about East and West? Well, I would say that in some way it makes sense because the certain terms, the certain concepts, while they are present in our talks, in our language, they are determining the certain reality. I'm not a fan of linguistic philosophy, but in some way we can say that it's happened. Well, if this debate is still valid, it means that there is a lot of reasons, there is a lot of system of interest which are still supporting actuality of this debate. But what, from my point of view, should be considered that in reality, this debate, it's not simply a debate of the periphery which is trying to defend its autonomy and its right to exist in front of the center. It's not simply an attempt to provincialize the Europe. The problem is that the whole this debate, it's provincial. Even if it's still up to date, if it's still requested, the whole context of the world from the early 90s drastically changed. And in fact, what made me feel uncomfortable, but honestly, I came to this conclusion only recently, that my beautiful project was at the very end reduced to East-West issues. Because in this way it was provincialized. Because the model which it proposed, it was practically alternative model of globalization. Alternative model for the whole world. It was very romantic and perhaps utopical, unrealizable, even if I think it's potentially realizable project. But being reduced to East-West issue, it was really reduced in its potentiality. And in fact, Alexander Brenner told me that he few months after Interpol opening, he visited New York and he met Vendagu. They spent some time in some bar on the Broadway. They talk a lot. Obviously, there was no personal conflict in between them because both of them became hyper famous in this moment thanks for this scandal of Interpol. At the very end, just when they left cafe and they were staying on the Broadway, Vendagu told him, "But you know, Alexander," no, he was saying Sasha, very tenderly, "You know, Sasha, Russia is gone. And Europe, it's not important anymore. Nowadays, it's time for China. It's our time." In other way, from 1996, the context has definitely changed. And the world in a new way became really global. So let us consider it. Let us keep it in mind when we are desperately, obsessively returning to East-West issue. Well, thank you.
Thank you.